A few months ago, I swapped all my Fuji gear, including a GFX50s, for this Sony A7Rv. But did I make a mistake? Stay tuned to find out. So the idea today is to try and replicate an image that I took around about a year ago on the GFX50. I have my Sony A7Rv set up. The light is pretty much the same. The location is identical. And as I say, this is the third time I've attempted this. The last two times the light's not been right or not been quite right enough. I've got the EXIF data on my phone so I can copy it over. This is the original image from the GFX5. I'll put that on the screen now. And I'm trying to replicate that on the A7Rv as closely as possible. And then I will take this back to Lightroom and we will compare the two images in Lightroom. We'll do some editing to them. We'll try and push and pull them around and we'll try and see which one has the most latitude. I suspect it will be the GFX50, but I'm very intrigued to see just how close a smaller sensor, full frame sensor on the A7Rv will be to that GFX50. So far I've been shooting with this camera for about a month. I've absolutely loved it. The quality is beautiful, but I've not had an opportunity to really pitch it up against that old GFX50. And today's the day. So I'm going to crack on. The light's looking like it's going to be pretty much the same as what I had last year, and I will get on and do the shoot. So welcome back to the studio. I've got the images into Lightroom and in a moment we'll go over there and have a look at them. This is quite an interesting test. First of all, although the A7Rv has an extra 10-11 million pixels, the difference is not quite as obvious as you might think because of the image ratios. Now the GFX50 has 50 megapixels but in a 4:3 ratio, so a slightly narrower format. The Sony on the other hand has 61 megapixels in a 3:2 format. So if you were to lop off that 3:2 and make it 4:3, they would be very, very similar megapixel counts. Now, obviously the GFX50 has a bigger sensor. It's a medium format sensor. It's about 25% larger, I think, in terms of surface area. However, it's 7 to 8 years older technology. So we're going to be comparing very, very similar megapixel counts, but different eras of technology and different sizes in sensor. I can't tell you how difficult this video has been to put together. Trying to match images from a year ago to a shoot taken this month has been really, really difficult. I've been out 3 times to try and get images to match and pretty much been unsuccessful in all cases. Yesterday's shoot down on the banks of the River Wear in Durham was probably the most successful. And what I've done is, rather than trying to match the EXIF data and the zoom ratios and all that, I've picked the 2 images that look the most similar. They're pretty similar in terms of shutter speed and aperture, and they're very, very similar in terms of their histogram output. And I think that's probably the most important factor. I've got the images in Lightroom. I'm going to go over there. As with all my videos, I haven't done anything other than slightly adjust the color balance on the GFX file to make it look fairly similar to the A7Rv. Both were imported with 20% image sharpening, default image sharpening. And we're going to go through these images. We're going to look at image sharpness. I'm then going to edit the GFX50 file to make it look a nice looking image. And then I'm going to try and match that image with the A7Rv and make that look very similar to the GFX50. And then we'll do a little bit of pixel peeping to see if we've got more noise in either one and how each has actually stood up to that editing. So I'm going to get into it and I'll see you in Lightroom. So as you can see, I now have both images in Lightroom. The one on the left is the Sony A7Rv, and I've color coded that red. And the one on the right is the Fujifilm GFX50, and I've color coded that green. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take them into an XY comparison. So if we select them and we click on the XY here, we have on the left hand side the Sony image, and on the right hand side we have the Fuji image. And if we go out to full screen view here, you can see they look broadly similar. If I click on the Sony, you can have a look at the histogram up here. And if I click on the Fuji, you can see the histogram is very, very similar. So there's not much to choose in terms of the exposure between the two of them. Let's zoom in. So I'm zooming in to 200%. This is on the Sony A7Rv. And if we zoom into 200% on the Fuji as well, and we bring them alongside each other, and you can see, I think that's pretty close. There's not a huge difference in the sharpness going on here. Ignoring the slight color differences and the lighting, looking into the details itself, if we move around, perhaps very slightly more sharpness in the GFX, but that would be to be expected. In terms of lenses, the GFX50 is using the 32 to 64 millimeter, which is one of the best zoom lenses you can buy for Fuji, whereas the Sony is using the 24 to 105, which is not quite as sharp as a 24 to 72.8. It's an f4 lens, perhaps not regarded as one of their best lenses, and yet I think it's actually holding up really well. Let's just move around the image a little bit and have a look at some other areas. Image sharpness wise, it's holding up really, really well. Let's just come down to this building here. There's lots of lovely detail in this building. Very, very close. In fact, down at this level, I would say the Sony is possibly just pipping it over the Fuji. Very, very little difference actually going on there. So let's go back to grid view, and we're going to take the Fuji image over into the develop module. We'll zoom it out, and we're just going to make this into a nice image. So let's bring the blacks down to get the maximum out of this histogram. We'll bring the highlights down like that, just to bring a little bit of detail into the sky. We're going to bring the shadows up. I've picked this image because it's quite a high contrast image. I think you need to do a little bit of manipulation on it like that. So if we brought those shadows up, I'm going to bring the overall exposure down a little bit to see if we can get some definition in that sky. We're not getting a whole lot in that sky at the moment. And I'm going to just warm it up a little bit like that. I think we'll bring the blacks down very slightly like that. And I think if we give it a little bit of dehaze, just a little bit, and a little bit of clarity. And I think if we just bump the vibrance a little bit, you can see just a little bit of detail coming out in that sky now. We bump the vibrance up like that. That's probably as nice an image we're going to get from this shot. Let's go to the Sony, and we're going to try and roughly match that image with the Sony. So again, we're going to just bring the exposure down a little bit, bring the highlights down to bring them inside. Then we're going to bring the shadows up, again, similar sort of levels. Going to bring the blacks down. And I think the sky's actually come in a little bit more perhaps on this one, but that could just be the lighting differences, so we won't go too much into that. So we'll add a little bit of dehaze to see if that sky comes in a little bit more, a little bit of clarity, and a little bit of vibrance to the image. Let's just compare the two. You can see the lighting is not quite the same between the two. So we're really looking more into the shadow areas, the highlight areas, to see what we could pull back. I think they're broadly similar. I think the Sony has a bit more punch. Let's just bring a little bit more clarity into this one so we can bring a bit more punch into it. Bring the whites up. This is the Fuji one. Let's take them back into the library module and have a look at them side by side. And I think in particular, we'll concentrate on the shadow areas. So we'll select them both and we'll take them into the comparison mode. We'll just bring them out for the moment. You can see that I think the color balance and the lighting is a bit flatter on the original Fuji one from last year. We've got a little bit more light in the sky, but I think in terms of, you know, as I said, I've tried to match the histogram to the images so they are broadly the similar exposure. I think you can see straight away that the Sony's brought in a little bit more sky detail compared to the Fuji. That could just be difference in the lighting from this year to last year. Let's zoom into the shadow areas and we'll come in down here and have a look at this. Okay, and we'll do the same on the Fuji. And we're at 200% here. And I can say that I think the Sony has held up really, really well in the shadow areas. Pretty much similar to the Fuji, to be honest. There's very, very little noise in the Sony shadow areas. Let's have a look at the water detail here. Again, no real noise in either of these images. So the editing on this Sony file has worked out really well in the shadow areas. We'll zoom out and have a look at the highlight areas. Both are inside the histogram, so there shouldn't be any clipping. So I think in the highlights, again, the Sony has done really, really well. That's not to say the Fuji is a slouch, but I think that the Sony has sort of surpassed my expectations in the amount that you can actually edit it. Now, overall, I think the image from the Sony A7Rv is actually a better looking image than the one from the Fuji. Let's ignore that the color's a little bit off and the light's a little bit different. The punchiness of the image from the Sony is, I think, nicer. It's a nicer looking image than the one from the Fuji. Now, we are talking 7 years, 8 years difference in technology and broadly similar megapixel counts. So that's been a really, really interesting comparison. The Sony has stood up really, really well compared to the Fuji. We're looking at newer technology on a smaller sensor, broadly similar megapixel counts when you factor in the image ratio. But when you've dropped them into Lightroom, edit them a similar sort of amount, ignoring the fact that it's slightly different lighting, slightly different focal lengths and stuff like that, the Sony has stood up really well. The sharpness of the Sony stands up to the medium format image, which really surprised me. The editing ability, the editing leeway that you have with the Sony has stood up to that of the Fuji. And I think that's really, really good. The question I asked at the beginning of this video was, have I made a mistake in going from the Fuji GFX to the Sony A7Rv? And in terms of my personal experience, that's categorically no. I have not made a mistake. I am very, very impressed with the quality of the Sony compared to the Fuji. And it would be interesting, if I could afford it, to actually pitch the Sony against the GFX50s, the more recent version. But unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen in the near future. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. It's been an interesting one to do. It's taken me a fair bit of time to actually do it, but I'm very pleased with the results. So if you've got any questions about the Sony or the Fuji that I've used in this comparison, please drop them in the comments below. That really does help my engagement. If you've enjoyed the video, a thumbs up would be absolutely brilliant, and a subscription would be even better. I'll see you in the next one.